Hello and welcome to the first installment of Setting the Table, conversations at the intersection of philanthropy, racial equity, and social justice. I am Sidney Hargro, he, him, president of Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia, along with my co-host and partner in Reimagining Philanthropy, Marcus Walton.
Wave Walton, Marcus. Hello, thank you.
Who's the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, also known to many of us as GEO. So Setting the Table is a new series that is in partnership, as a partnership between Philanthropy Network and GEO, where we hope to set a virtual table. Maybe someday we'll get to a face-to-face table. For now, it's a virtual table. And create a brave space for unscripted real talk at the intersection of philanthropy, racial equity, and social justice. It is our hope that this feels less like a panel and more like a conversation that's an honest conversation between peers who are simply dedicated to transformative change. Marcus, at this time, I'm going to invite you to say a few words, if you will, before we invite our esteemed guests to the table.
Great. Thank you, Sidney. And I'd love to see when the participant screen moves to an additional window. So as you all keep joining, we want to welcome you into, as Sidney mentioned, a brave space. I just want to underscore the thing about this space that from its origin, we understood as special is that we really invite in the kinds of questions that traditionally, maybe historically, didn't feel as welcome into certain conversations. This is the conversation where you can ask those questions. We actually wanted to make as the premise the foundation of questions that get to the complexity of these issues. We believe so much in the mission of setting the table for advancing these conversations that we believe to not welcome a variety of questions that are asked in earnestness, right? But genuine questions that may not be the norm, but are at the core of perhaps some tensions that tend to make people want to avoid moving forward as opposed to lean into something. This is the space for leaning in. This is a space where we invite attention, we explore, and we support discovery. So we're inviting you into this discovery. We request that you, like any other space that you hold as sacred even, that we allow for confidentiality, that we maintain the content here and let the lessons go forward, that you speak from the I, that you speak from your experiences, and that you consider a different way of thinking about a thing that you already know. So I'm inviting you to suspend what you know and explore what's possible outside of that. That's what this space is all about. So thank you, Sidney. And representing GEO, we appreciate this partnership and the opportunity for a different kind of conversation.
Absolutely. So today we get to kick this off, and I can't think of two better people to kick it off with truth and honesty in this work that we do than Rodney Foxworth, CEO of Common Future, and Erika, Seth, Davies, founder of Racial Equity Asset Lab, both who I've known for quite a while, and I think Marcus has as well. And today the topic that we're going to seek to unpack and talk about is reimagining wealth and capitalism. Reimagining wealth and capitalism. So just to get us started, just like to place, one question on the table, and obviously, Marcus and others, speakers can join in to address this question. But, we're sitting in October. October's in 2020 is moving fast. And 2020, if nothing else, has shined a giant spotlight on systems of racial inequity in our nation. This is no more evident than in our economic system. Rodney, I think in a recent piece that you wrote, you you noted a statistic that we hear all the time, and that is that 1% of the world's wealth is held by 47% of people. I'm sorry, that the world's wealth is held by 1%. And that in the US, 1% is of 39, I'm sorry, the America's wealth is also held mostly by the 1%. So I'd like to, for you, Rodney, for you and Erika, just like tell us, like, what does this mean for philanthropy, right? What is the relationship between this disparity in our economic system and philanthropy?
Well, I appreciate the question, Sidney. I'm really glad to be able to be in conversation with you all. To address the question, I mean, maybe it's not obvious, but from our perspective, obviously, philanthropy, and obviously, we're talking about this, having this conversation. We're talking about philanthropy. We're not talking about, individual giving from, say, folks like my parents and volunteerism and those sort of things. We're talking about institutions primarily, families of significant wealth. And so philanthropy is obviously implicated by our economic system. You cannot have philanthropic institutions as they're constructed without these sorts of disparities that exist in the system. And so philanthropy is, I believe, is really an outcome of the significant and disproportionate levels of concentrated wealth and power, both in the US and globally. And so when you ask the question, Sidney, it really is an opportunity, I think, for those in philanthropy to consider and evaluate, challenge themselves on how philanthropy can be a disruptor of systems and not perpetuate systems. One stat I think about, for example, particularly as we think about racial inequality, and the title of this whole conversation, setting the table. Well, in philanthropy, you have to ask the question, who gets to set the table? Who gets to craft the menu? Who gets to make the decisions? And so, for example, we know that about 88% of foundation executives are white, which does not reflect the diversity of the US, for example. And so those are the types of things that, I think philanthropy can begin to, and has begun to ask and evaluate. Could do much more of it, of course. And this is why, the work that you, Sidney, Marcus, and of course what Erika is doing with the Racial Equity Asset Lab is just so necessary. And I think one last piece of this is when we think about philanthropy, oftentimes the conversation is fundamentally rooted mostly in the grant making side of it, of the conversation. And I think, Erika is someone who said, I believe it was you, Erika, that put it, and I know others have said this, that, philanthropy, foundations are effectively financial service firms that do some grant making, right? And so, I think we have to have a conversation about the that investment side, because that's really where so much power sits within philanthropic institutions. So I think in these conversations, we have to also ensure that we're discussing endowments, the governance of those endowments, where the capital is being invested, how, and for what purpose.
Definitely. Go ahead.
Thank you for having me on this discussion. I think the last time I was just in a conversation with Rodney was years ago when he released his piece, Black Rage and Philanthropy. And so it's super appropriate that we are here again. Excuse me, it's unfortunate, but it is appropriate. So thank you all for having me. I think just to extend even what Rodney was saying, that we have a culture, I think I read somewhere, so relevant. We have a political culture of forgetting without knowing. And so there is a desire to move quickly past the things that we actually don't even really know, right? Like we don't even really fully understand and think intentionally about the roots of the system that have brought us here. And philanthropy is part of that system. That at one point in time made the decision, there were folks who decided that we were going to dehumanize an entire people for profit. And that's at the root of this. Like, this right to profit was such that we could determine and make effective through policy that Blackness was a thing, because it wasn't at one time, there was a thing, and that there was value assigned to it, and whiteness was a thing, and there would be value assigned to it, and everything came from that. And so philanthropy is part of that system. And so when we think about institutional philanthropy and who created this particular structure, which is also made up, right? Like that 95% of assets need to be held in perpetuity, you know, so that these things can exist in perpetuity. That's contrived. Like, it doesn't have to be that way. And so if we are talking about reimagining, it's, you know, I think it's getting to the truth of the matter and then reimagining from there, because a lot of these things, these are not immutable laws of nature. This is not like gravity, right? So we have to be willing to just to think about unpacking all of it, and from there, kind of saying, okay, well, what is possible in the next iteration of this? And so Rodney's right. Really, foundations are investors that do a little grant making on the side, because if 95% of your assets are on the market, and only 5% are going to grant making, really, what are you doing with that 95%? Are you actually investing in things that make your philanthropy necessary? And when you look at any system, regardless of what it states it's about, if you look at a system and how it behaves, that tells you what its purpose is. So when we look at the system of philanthropy and how it behaves, really, what is the purpose of it? Is it to improve humanity, quality of life? I mean, those are a lot of things that we talk about with this work, but when you watch how the process unfolds and how the system behaves, I think we can be pretty clear that a lot of it is to perpetuate white supremacy culture and ideas, and to continue to concentrate those assets in the hands of a few. And based on the structure of philanthropy, there's not much accountability, right? So there's no market pressure. There are no customers or clients of foundations. There's no political pressure. Who's telling foundations what they need to do outside of the IRS? And they're busy, right? So they're not providing a whole heap of oversight either. And so there's not much that can be done other than sort of mission-related pressure or so even public pressure. But if Ford and Barron decide, you know what, we're going to totally the opposite direction, they could do that, right? Any foundation can do that. And so how do we pay attention to those things so that we can, again, reimagine something completely different?
Oh, that's a great intro into a deeper conversation. I just heard a really intriguing way of thinking about the purpose of this space. In a conversation with a colleague, we were talking about going from the ethereal to the material, right? And so you just laid a very important context in which to think about philanthropy, and an understanding that there are these things out here called systems, which for me sounds a lot like people. So I'm wondering, Erika and Rodney, Erika, if you could help us understand a little bit about the labs and how it's intentionally connected to affecting the kind of change that we're talking about. And then Rodney, maybe you can follow with the same thing so we can understand what each of you are doing with your initiative.
Sure. Marcus, you'll remember when I was at AbbVie, I had actually just arrived at AbbVie from working with an institutional asset management firm. It was a Black-owned asset management firm. And we had such challenge, as I learned in the role that I occupied, in accessing foundations and endowments as clients. There were public pensions that were a very clear pathway as to how we would access those clients. But it was uphill battle. And I would reach out to colleagues in the field that I knew of who were working at foundations that had made very clear statements about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the time. But there was no discussion or no appetite really for talking about the opportunity for diverse firms. So when I was coming into AbbVie and the RPBC framework was rolling out, I was really clear. I was like, there's a really big equity issue that's not being discussed anywhere in philanthropy as far as I can see, and that is how these endowments are being managed and who is managing these endowments. And after doing some work around the access, I eventually started to do some work on the how, right? Like there was the who, and that is incredibly important as a point of entry when you're thinking about how to approach endowment management from a race lens. Very important point of entry, but it's not the only way. And so I was starting to do more work in impact investing. And when I was early days in impact investing, I was stunned that we would be talking about environmental, social, and governance issues and impact on performance, but not talking about race at the intersection of those things. I couldn't really frame out how do you do impact without being intentional about addressing racial disparities, because that's like, what other impact could you possibly think you were going to have if not dealing with those intentionally, and certainly around the F's, right? Like I couldn't quite figure it out. And I'll go into these rooms and part of these conversations and realize, like, oh my God, this is just kind of Wall Street. They've just taken off suits and put on jeans. This hasn't changed drastically in terms of who is at the table and making decisions and really what we're talking about. And that was a point of intersection actually when I first met Rodney as well. And just starting to try to build momentum in this space that was supposed to be about mission alignment and an impact, right? Social impact. And so making the connections between racial equity and impact investing, I like to say trying to bring justice to capital is the work that I'm doing with the Racial Equity Asset Lab. So identifying the networks of people who are being intentional about this work, not in a performative way, but really have started to dig in and understand different frameworks, different approaches about racial equity and impact investing, and looking at those different layers. That's looking at the data, what research and reports are out here, and where are some of the gaps that exist in terms of research collection and data. Also looking at strategies. If we're going to try to move to a new economy, a more inclusive economy, we've got to see what's out here, who's doing what that is new and innovative, or just more inclusive. And so trying to get a sense of what are some of the opportunities either for asset owners to do their work differently, or what are some of the opportunities to invest in that are shifting the ownership of capital, but also decision making in that process. And then finally, thinking about education. So when I was at AbbVie and we would work with different foundations, and this still happens to me to this day, when I meet with investment team and program team, it's like they don't work in the same space. And this is in places where there's a very strong commitment even to advancing racial equity and racial justice within the mission. And so how to start making more intentional connections between those two sides. What is the education that needs to happen, or the translation that needs to happen between those two teams, just so that we can make a little bit more progress within the field in the space. I know program officers who don't necessarily know what PRIs are or how to access that resource on behalf of some of the grantees that really could benefit from that tool, and investment team members who don't necessarily know how to leverage the program team to source deals. And so how do we start to help people think about that, again, much more intentionally, and making those connections for shifting resources. Great. So that's it. I'm housed at Common Future. So I'm a social entrepreneur in residence with Common Future as well. And then also doing some research at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation that's focused explicitly on diverse manager engagement. That's it.
Right, thank you. Anything you want to add to that, Rodney? I'm sure Sidney has something burning that he wants to share.
Well, go ahead first. Rodney, if you want to add anything, go ahead.
Absolutely, thank you. So one thing I just wanted to emphasize before I get into some other comments is that it's important to really uplift Erika's work in the Racial Equity Asset Lab for a number of reasons, but one in particular is that, again, when we're talking about setting the table, who gets to make the invitations, who gets to set the menu. One thing that is very clear in our sector is typically we have to influence institutions to have an orientation around racial equity. And by that, I mean, we don't oftentimes see a real emerge. So in Erika being able to lead this work, we typically invest in a different type of way. And so I think it's really important to recognize the importance of actually investing in leaders, supporting the types of work that the real offers, because there is no need to influence what Erika is doing, right? It's baked into the DNA. And this is just an example, I think, what happens in the sector in which we do not invest in, say, Black women, for example, to lead in spaces in which there's already authority, lived experience, capacity, and ability. We try to do it in a different way. And so there are a number of folks that I think operate in this space that are deserving of that type of support from the sector. So I just want to name that and elevate it. This is why the Racial Equity Asset Lab is so critically important, and Erika's work is so important. So for Common Future, I think for this conversation, Marcus and Sidney, we can break it down into 3 areas as it relates to how we see the material impact of racial equity, how our work is implicated in it. So one thing for context, we sort of do kind of work in 2 areas primarily. One, resourcing practitioners on the ground in different communities across the country who are really leading and building alternative mechanisms for a different type of economy, right? Particularly with a focus on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color communities. We also work and engage with foundations and funders around how to best support their efforts to actually invest in a racially equitable way that attempts to push the boundaries a bit into moving into, as Erika pointed out, if not a new economy, at least a more inclusive economy. And so for on one side of it, we've been able to, particularly since 2020, has really revealed for so many people, just the significant racial disparities that exist in our economy and the system generally. But we've been able to support a range of efforts from the practitioners in our network to be able to really lean into that reimagining piece. Supporting, helping to provide that innovation capital that enables leaders on the ground to shape something that's a bit different, that looks, that might raise eyebrows from some in philanthropy because it's really about power building a different type of economic model. So that's one piece of it. And so we do that work. We also have been working on prototyping alongside folks in our network, different types of capital and economic models that will really be able to, that we hope we can influence philanthropy and investors, actually. These models are ones that center racial equity, that center power building for institutions and organizations that are led by and serve communities that have been historically extracted. And so when Erika was talking about PRIs, program-related investments, think about how to best leverage that sort of capital. What are other ways that we can actually build the ownership and governance and power of organizations that, again, are led by folks that have been historically extracted from exploited. I say historically, but it's happening every day, obviously. And then finally, there's a body of work, to Erika's point, about education and sort of support that my colleague, Catherine Witt, leads. And that's really, we've had a long-term program that we've worked about 45 place-based foundations across the country and also in Canada to support efforts around how do you change your culture, how do you build a strategy, how do you increase your capacity as it relates to actually investing in ways either from your endowment or PRI, or if you're a community foundation or DAF holder, how do you leverage those resources to do it as well? And so that gets us sort of the brass tacks, Marcus, to your point. And I think those efforts, working with those 45 foundations, I think reveals for our team so many of the barriers that are in the way. And I think the way you put it, Marcus, people, you think when you say systems, you think about people. Well, there's also culture around that, right? What are the implicit policies and also the explicit policies? As Erika pointed out, there are things that we take as dogma that do not have to exist, that can actually shift. And so, through the work with those foundations and others, we've seen the barriers, we've seen how much it takes for as individuals to be able to effectively untrain, retrain yourself or be retrained in a different type of way to not necessarily to uncover those biases, whether individually and institutionally. Those are sort of the things that we have seen from the work that we've done. And we've seen the material shift when, for example, you're able to recognize that there are opportunities in your community that's majority African-American, say, where there are opportunities to actually invest and do so in a meaningful way. That there's talent and opportunity in places where, your philanthropic institution may have ignored for a range of reasons, to your point, Marcus, but really doing the work of how you need to unravel those practices. I mean, the program, the Foundation Circle that I'm referencing, it's an 18-month program, for example, because we see that it takes some time to be able to retrain. And we're looking at other sorts of ways to ensure that we can effectively support, guide, I dare say, challenge and instigate, depending on the scenario, to move more quickly in that area. Because again, we've seen in 2020, we don't have, communities that have been extracted from and exploited. They've been facing it for a long time. Urgency looks a lot different for the communities that are actually impacted than might for an institution that is sort of is a bit removed. And so how can we make it something that's more efficient, and how can we move more quickly?
One of the questions that popped into my head as I listened to the both of you, Rodney and Erika, and I think it's something that I know definitely that I've talked to foundations that are wrestling with, and that is, on the one hand, this idea of perpetuity, right? Whether or not perpetuity is the way or spin down, right? That's one piece. Or this idea of, as you put it, Erika, bringing justice to capital, right? Being in perpetuity, but investing differently. And I think, Rodney, you call it in one of your pieces like restorative investing, right? So where do you fall on that spectrum? Like, as far as like, how do you think about those two things? Because one, on the surface, it looks like one is kind of counter to the other, right? If one is investing better over a longer period of time to be able to address changing needs, and one is maybe investing, currently too, but spending down and then not having it. So give me what are your thinking about it? Tell me about your thinking regarding that.
So I've been trying to do less binary thinking, actually, and
yeah.
and to say we should do all of it, right? Like we should think about the complexities along the way. While capitalism is deeply problematic, this is the system in which we're operating right now. And so how do we catch the shift, right? Like, how do we build a new while old is actually being clear that it's not effective, and what's the space in between. And so I think understanding that all of those things, like more foundations just need to question, do we need to exist in perpetuity, while more need to question how they're using their dollars as well. And then more need to say, how do we leverage or activate this full spectrum of capital that we have, such that every decision from grant all the way to market rate returns are being intentional. And every dollar that we turn, we're going to be much more intentional about who's at the table, who's not at the table, and why are they not at the table? How will this decision affect these different communities, BIPOC communities, women, being intersectional about the thinking as well. So I think there's a whole lot of plenty of capital and plenty of room for all of those questions and all of those discussions, and quite frankly, all of those decisions to be made. But right now, it's like we're in like an extreme on what's possible. And right now, it's 95% invested, 5% in grant making. When that is not, it's not working. And so how do we think about what any of these foundations could be doing differently that would be right for either an issue or a community, and how they might respond more appropriately.
No, I appreciate that comment. All the way from the, binary thinking perhaps being one of the sneaky little ways in which our socialization into these dominant cultural values actually reinforces the challenges, the problems. Certainly, we don't have access to the fullest set of possibilities when we're thinking in terms of either this or that, right? There's more. But I'm curious. I'm picking up on Adam's comment over here in the chat around private foundations and perpetuity and the harm that they cause being significantly greater than the good caused by grant making, right? And I'm holding this as a perspective for consideration, right? And as I read that comment and considered what he offered for foundations, not considering the impact of the social impact without taking into account the impact of their investment decisions. So connecting the investment decision with the societal impact. Help me understand, and this is all about asking the tough questions. So I'm going to go and kind of model it for the rest of the group. How do we connect the dots for those of us who struggle around this emphasis on investing in Black communities or communities of color or Black-led organizations? So how are these connected? How does the investment in the one translate to the greater good in the other?
So Marcus, I'm going to try to respond and also pick up on what Erika pointed out. So let me just first say I'm a radical pragmatist. So I don't. So I think there's the range of spectrum that we're talking about that Erika is speaking to is appropriate. However, let me speak on what I think the preferred option will be, right? Not to step back into binary thinking. However, so since this is a brave space that Marcus and Sidney have set up. So I said earlier that the stat that 88% of foundation executives are white, as an example. The philanthropic sector has wrestled with this challenge for quite some time. And so one of the things about perpetuity is really that's a conversation at the end of the day about who maintains power and control. So if there had been market improvements in the history of philanthropy, I think I'd be a bit more optimistic about, encouraging perpetuity of institutions, right? We haven't seen that. I mean, we've seen some improvements and then we step back and et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about perpetuity, I think about what's the opportunity from an investment from the philanthropic sector to actually invest in the perpetual power and economies of BIPOC communities, deprioritizing their own institutional perpetuity, but actually emphasizing the power and capacity of communities that are most directly impacted. And so that is something that we've seen some institutions that have opted to become spin down. I've heard a foundation say they're not trying to be a spin down, but if they invest out, that's one thing. Like they're investing, if they go out because of their investments, that's another thing, but they're not necessarily intentionally trying to spin down. But I think about, something like I think about the Chorus Foundation, for example, that made an intentional decision to spin down, but it was also intentional around why they're spending down, leveraging their capital to build the economic muscle and power of particular communities that they have been invested in. It wasn't to say, hey, we're just going to spin down to spin down. It was, we're investing actually in a longer term capacity for communities, leveraging whatever resources that we have. And and so I want to, step back into what Erika pointed out of, we have an opportunity to reimagine. And so when we talk about perpetuity, we're also talking about power and control, who holds it, who wields it. And thus, what are opportunities for foundations and other philanthropic entities and individuals to actually invest in economic power for the long term? So to your question, Marcus, and lifting up what Adam pointed out, I take some examples where we see foundations that have pointed out, hey, look, we're investing in ways that are actually diametrically opposed to like our grant making, right? We're trying to ensure that there are quality employment opportunities in communities. And on the one hand, we're investing in companies that, and enterprises that actually are pushing low wages, or we're investing in, as our friends at Activest have been pushing, how to ensure that municipal bonds that in cities that do not get most of their revenue from disproportionate impact on communities of color, from fees and over policing, for example. So foundations are implicated in that as well, right? If you're trying to have a racial justice or criminal justice agenda while at the same time investing in the for-profit prison industry or investing in municipal bonds that actually are owned by cities that are disproportionately fining and incarcerating Black and brown folks, that's actually opposed to your grant making strategy. And if you're investing more in that than you're granting out, then you can see the dilemma that you're in. So I think Marcus and Sidney and Erika, I think that's sort of the way that I look at it. Obviously, there is a spectrum. Again, I'm a radical pragmatist, so I don't believe every institution should and will move in the same direction. But in an ideal state, if we're really trying to ensure that there's an opportunity for communities to actually will power and have their own perpetuity around power, that's the direction I think we should be going.
That's great. Thank you. So I think just picking up on the latter part of that, when you talk about investing in leveraging the power within Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx communities, like what are the examples of foundations who have moved from primarily grant making entities into this space? Like what's your advice for even thinking about, like today I've been making grants in communities for XYZ, but now interested, but where do I start? Like that hasn't been my skill set or my thinking. So how do you get started with that?
Just in terms of, I think part of it is who is at the table, right?
Yeah.
Like in terms of getting started. So
Yeah.
folks on the program team would probably need to start reaching out to the finance and investment team and asking those questions. Tell me about what you do. And starting to get an analysis that way. I think, MIE does a pretty good intro, like just an intro, right? Just back to that, forgetting without knowing aspect of it, like understanding the system in which we are operating really well. Because that's where I started to figure out, because I was working at an asset management firm, that was the first time I saw capital markets and how much money was actually moving in that space. And so you do have to lean in just to start to understand the basics and the objectives. Ask to see your investment policy for your foundation so that you can start to see what they have prioritized in terms of that endowment and its investments. Because when all else fails, that's what everybody goes back to. What does the IPO tell us we're supposed to do in terms of the balance of our portfolio? How is it supposed to be allocated? And in what percentage is that supposed to be allocated across asset class? So if you want to know what a foundation values, that is a really, really good place to start actually with that particular document. I think there is a pretty steep learning curve on that, but for those folks who might sit in a position of leadership or at a board level or a committee level, I think it's asking those questions as well. Have we even thought about what our resources are doing outside of the grant making? Like we got that, we know, we see report after report about that, but what are the other dollars that we're doing? What are those doing in different communities as well? And then I think having the brave space conversation about the mindset that supports all of this. Somebody just put decolonizing wealth in here. That's an excellent resource. And I would also suggest the Winners Take All is another. Those two are like companion books for understanding the mindset that's supporting all of this. Actually, I was just about to start talking about the mindset that holds this stuff in place. And they question what it is that we've all been taught to believe for so long in very practical ways. And so I think until we can start to take these conversations that have been marginalized because they seem too radical and start to make them part of the center, and to so Rodney is no longer a radical pragmatist, but this is pragmatic. Until we can start to have conversations about risk, like how we're defining risk, quite frankly, like status quo is pretty risky. And so if we are, because that's another thing that is, that's not fixed, right? Risk is not a fixed notion. And so like, how do we start thinking about that a lot differently as well? And so I think it just takes more dialogue on these issues, again, to start moving the Overton window, shifting that until this is an acceptable conversation as well, because it's a long haul and systems seek to preserve themselves. So the existing one is not going to go down easily, and we might see like little pieces of success along the way, but if we're really trying to move this, it is going to take a lot of pressure from several different directions. And so that learning on the front end is crucial.
And Rodney, like related to this, I know that we met each other as a part of the Runway Project, which was about trying to find ways to invest in friends and family capital for Black-led or businesses, right? So again, like, how does philanthropy get involved in this way?
Yeah, Sidney, Marcus, I think there are many opportunities out there. So you bring up the Runway Project. I think to Erika's point, it takes leadership. It takes willingness to step into something and hold an agenda that, we talk about risk. Again, I think, especially over even the last year, even when we think about and within philanthropy, philanthropic institutions, and Marcus and Sidney, you probably heard this from many. I've heard this from so many of our, peers who are leaders of color or folks of color within philanthropies that have really stepped on the edge to push and instigate for change. And those folks are, quite frankly, the most vulnerable in these scenarios, right? And so I think from a leadership perspective, it's who else needs to be stepping up to hold that, right? To actually be able to make space to ensure that, folks of color are not the only ones at risk. As it were. And so that's one piece of it, is the leadership. I think the hardest part is the distinction between investments and grant making within institutions, and they're also different, but having a real agenda, and I say this in a positive way, because, Erika didn't speak to this, but quite frankly, she was able to lead, I think it was a successful effort within the foundation herself, and the efforts to be able to facilitate dialogue and communication and education between different stakeholders within that philanthropic institution, to have an agenda that prioritized racial equity and did not settle for, because our investment advisor said this is difficult, we can't do it. Right? We find this so often where oftentimes we forget who investment advisors, for example, work for. They actually work for the institution, not the other way around. And so this is actually something that we find. I think this is part of the comfort levels that people may or may not have as it relates to investing. But there are more and more opportunities to engage with the right sort of infrastructure, as it were, and more institutions that have been paving the way, as it were. And so there's actually quite a bit, I think, that what I find what I'm optimistic about is that you can actually, turn to someone, you can turn to institutions that have been doing this work for some time to learn lessons from and engage with and have an opportunity to learn. And so I think we're now at a point where we have to be able to challenge the mindset and the culture of investing that has perpetuated itself for so long. That is the hardest part. And it requires leadership at the first level, because once you've been able to make those internal shifts around culture, once you've been able to make those internal shifts around strategy, the technical pieces become quite a bit easier, right? They become quite a bit easier, because Sidney pointed out with the Runway Project, that initial design that Sidney and others worked on was quite creative. But the reason why I was able to be creative is because the people who shaped it already had racial justice at their core and center. Already were looking to build something differently. And so it looked like it might have been more complicated, but quite frankly, it wasn't that complicated for us when we built it. because we already had the intention and agenda set. And so I just want to emphasize that element, that how important leadership actually is within this. It's not always the overly technical component. It's actually the cultural and strategic piece and the leadership piece that actually drives so much of this work.
Yeah, that's a beautiful full circle connection too, to the question I posed, which is a commonly asked question in some of the spaces that I've been a part of. Like, why invest in these Black-led or people of color-led organizations? How is that translating into the types of liberatory, expansive, inclusive, the kind of impact that we're talking about? And it's just what you said. These communities actually have been left out of the conversation altogether. So just the mining of information is actually remiss. We're making up for lost time, and this information has just been dormant or unused in ways that actually can impact our work immediately. At least that's been our experience. So thank you for that. And Elizabeth, thank you over in the chat room. Again, it's been a really active chat room. Thanks for those of you. We try to appeal to all of the different senses and types of engagement. And lastly, as a part of that, we believe that these kind of brave spaces are just scratching the surface for deeper discussion. Right? So hopefully you look across, or you see some of the folks in the room as people with whom you can follow up. Right? So we want to encourage approaching these issues collaboratively, seeing each other. I want to point out Adam and Dwayne, like some really vigorous, there was like great conversation over there around numbers and reports and how we know what we know. But the point there is that there was some energy that was generated. These are generative conversations, as opposed to those that are race informed that tend to get stuck, right? They're so tense, and the desire to be right is so high that when we don't have complete agreement, they tend to break down. That's been my experience in these conversations. And so the final part of this, to really reinforce and model this idea of collective wisdom, which I've been describing, is to open it up for a conversation. So like I said, we want to invite you to ask those questions directly. I'm looking at some faces. I love to do this. I'm not calling you out, but Ty, your face throughout this presentation has been really interesting. Mindy, you have that face where I just want to know, like, what is beneath the glasses there? What's coming through in that mind of hers, right? It's all kind of folks here. So we want to give you some space to enter directly. And feel free to unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable writing it, we'll read your question out. But anyone in the space, Diana, I didn't forget about you too. You keep but for each of you out there who is just curious, like, this is the moment to ask that question. Please take advantage of that. Anyone who's interested, please just feel free to ask. I saw a finger from Vanessa.
Vanessa.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for this. I am part of the Philanthropy Network's new cohort doing the deeper dive and study into missionalized aligned investing. I'm really excited to be here. You've mentioned a few things. So a couple of you have said there's a lot of opportunities to invest, particularly in sort of Black entrepreneur space. I'm here because of Valentine Foundation, a local women foundation focused on women and girls empowerment. But I'm also involved with a national denomination, the Unitarian Universalists. Got them to expand their commitment to community investing from 1% to 5%. And traditionally, for the last 20 years, we've been doing CDFIs, which are great. But at this point, I consider them essentially long-term CDs, because that industry has very, it's survived and it's thrived and it's pretty locked in. So it's no longer cutting edge. So I'm looking at a couple of things I found is Melissa Bradley's 1863 Fund and Collab Capital by Jules Burke Solomon. So you mentioned this Run Rate project. Is there a list or resources that you have or we will get of those type of funds, Black women-led funds that are focused on new majority entrepreneurs, things like that?
So depending on what kind of investment strategy you're looking for, there aren't public lists. So the last one that was published was actually at Apathy, quite frankly. And so that is one of the resources actually, and a platform Rodney and I are working on developing for foundations to actually be able to interact with one another and with diverse firms as well. So we're working on, we have the infrastructure, working on the funding to be able to get that launched, which would allow, again, that direct conversation with the different types of asset management firms, whether it's, a fund to fund or manager of manager that specializes in BIPOC asset firms or the firms directly themselves. So recognizing that is a bit of a gap in this space is something that we're working on intentionally. But a public free list that hasn't been around for quite some time, unfortunately. I hope that answers the question, but they are out there. And so I don't know which consultant you're working with in either capacity, but if your consultant is telling you that they don't know where to find them or that they're not able to surface them, then you probably need to start thinking about issuing an RFP for a new consultant because the field has developed to the point where there are quite a few. So our oldest Black-owned asset management firms are 37 years old, and that would be Ariel Investments and Brown Capital Management. There are private equity firms, there are venture firms. Venture still needs some growth, but there are firms across asset classes that you should be able to access. So again, if your consultant is saying that's not possible, or we don't know where to find them, it's time to think about that relationship. And there are some membership organizations that you can be in touch with as well. So, and we can drop those in the chat, but the National Association of Securities Professionals, the New America Alliance, the National Association of Investment Companies. These are all spaces where women and people of color owned firms congregate, basically. And so you would be able to get some insight into who's in their membership as well. They're not going to be able to recommend, they don't advise, but that's a source of quite a bit of information, and you can attend their conferences at any time. Usually investors are allowed to attend for free. So those are different places that you can encounter firms as well.
So one quick
we
thing.
Can gather, I'm just saying we can gather that information and make sure that we get it out to everyone with the follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really quickly, because Sidney, we mentioned Runway Project. So I think about the Black Innovation Alliance, which I believe Melissa Bradley and many others are a part of. And so I think part of this actually is, Vanessa, is for everyone to recognize there are so many different pathways that particularly BIPOC entrepreneurs and other institutions have been creating, given that they're excluded from or disproportionately excluded from more of the traditional pathways that I think a lot of investment offices are more familiar with. And so there's all these alternative type of pathways that have been created. And so I just want to point that out. And one of the things that Erika pointed out about Brown, it's interesting because I think Brown is the either the largest or second largest Black-owned firm in there. One of the things that Eddie Brown talks about is the fact that they have not been they're surprised by how little they have under management considering their performance. And so this goes back to recognizing some of the biases. So there are opportunities, even if you're looking at a more traditional rate of return that you're looking at, you've got Black-owned firms that are doing quite well, but don't have as much under management. How do you get your investment advisor or get a new investment advisor that acknowledges those biases and actually will connect to those existing institutions? Those are all questions that I think really are just kind of grounded into the biases that are held, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Not to give a commercial or advertisement for any particular firm, but I watched how the Silicon Valley Community Foundation actually influenced not just what they wanted to get out of a process, but how they actually influenced how an entire consulting firm did their work and approached these issues. And so when they wanted to get a diverse managers for their endowment, for their lineup, the firm that they were working with, Colonial Consulting, which may be a familiar one to some folks on the call, Colonial, they weren't even tracking that information at the time. And so Silicon Valley asked 3 questions. How many diverse firms are in your research list? How many firms are you promoting to your clients, and how many of those firms are people of color owned firms when you do? And what those 3 questions prompted was like, and they've been on this journey ever since, that has even started to have an analysis of their name. You can't go around here being named Colonial Consultant, but it's like this full arc of those 3 questions led to such a reflection for that firm that they have had to operate differently, because I remember having a conversation about this where Silicon Valley basically held, we could get what we want out of this process, but we wouldn't change anything for anyone else in the field if we take it that way. And so because they demanded regular reporting on this data, Colonial had to go back and had to figure out, okay, well, we're not tracking it, so we will now track this information. So now we have the data, and then realize, oh wait, we're not in touch with and pulling in more diverse firms and meeting with them. So they, started to develop that. I mean, come full circle, their whole sponsorship budget is different. The way they have a person on their team. And again, I'm not trying to advertise for this firm, but I'm just talking about the influence of one, albeit the largest community foundation in the country, but it was the influence of this client that said this isn't sufficient for us. And so there is the ability to actually push, and it's happening so much now. I can't imagine anybody just being like, nope, we're not interested and we're not doing it anymore, because there are plenty of folks out here ready to pick that up. So I would just re-emphasize the influence that does exist when people do want to see change externally as well.
Well, thank you all so much. We're going to have to stop it here, at least the verbal part. We're going to encourage the writing, keep it going. We have emails, we have follow-up, we have promises to respond to with some of the resources that we talked about. I see Erika updated in the chat some of the names, some of the organizations that she mentioned in rattling off the names of places that you can go. This is exactly what Sidney and I hoped when we thought about this idea of setting the table. We could have had a conversation with Erika and Rodney on a Zoom call that was powerful and yet contained within 4 people, right? And now we got a chance to share it amongst 40 people who hopefully will go out and maybe reach 400 people exponentially with this information. And this is just the beginning, right? It's the beginning around the topic, but also the process of asking the tough questions, of providing the very genuine, complex responses that don't always feel welcome, but leaning into the complexity and being, Rodney, what was that description? Practical.
Radical pragmatist.
Radical pragmatist. I think there's a little radical pragmatism in all of us, and be invited into spaces that really encourage us to explore and express how we hold those things. So I appreciate you all. Sidney, I'm going to give you the final word as my co-conductor here, and appreciate you.
I thank you all for being here. Erika, Rodney, thank you thank you both for what you're doing and leading change in the way that you're leading change. We couldn't do this without you. And I just really appreciate your time today. And I always like to close with just thoughts that linger in my mind after the conversation. And it's this whole idea of the status quo is risky, right? Like this notion of like, we have to do something different. If we really want to see change in a next normal beyond what we're looking at right now, we have to lean in the risk. And so thank you all for bringing that to the fore. Thank you, Marcus. And with that, we can close out. Thank you all, and please have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.